Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on cybersecurity budgeting, where we'll be covering how to build, justify, and optimize your security investment. We're really excited to cover this topic, but before we start, I'm going to cover just a few housekeeping items. So first, we'll aim to run about 60 minutes today. Second, this webinar is being recorded and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after the event. And lastly, attendees are in listen only mode, but you can enter questions into the Q&A function as we go. We are saving some of those 60 minutes for today at the end to get to as many of those questions as possible. With that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. So first and most importantly, we have Josh McNulty. He is a virtual chief information security officer at DataPrize, who has more than a decade of experience in cybersecurity, helping customers go through processes like cyber budgeting and so much more. And second, there is me. My name is Stephanie Hamrick. I am the senior marketing manager at DataPrize, and I will be the moderator for today. So next, I'll tell you just very quickly about DataPrize for those who don't know us. We have been around since 1995, providing IT services end-to-end for our clients who are located across the United States. We believe technology should enable you all to be the best at what you do. So on our side, we deliver best-in-class managed help desk, cybersecurity, network, infrastructure, collaboration, end user, the list goes on and on and on. We do all those things to help you get there. Now, let me share a little bit about what is in store. So, we have three sections for you today that will help you get started on each stage of the budgeting process. So, we're going to start off talking about some of the preparation steps you should take that bring clarity to your budgeting process. Then, we're going to talk about how you can get started building your budget. And we'll finish off by covering how you can justify the budget that you've created to your business leadership and also how to keep it optimized over time. So with that, we will move right into our first section, preparing for the budgeting process. And we're going to start by talking about the importance of focusing on budgeting specifically for cybersecurity. So Josh, do you want to talk about why this is so important for organizations to focus on?
Yeah, Stephanie, thank you. It's absolutely important to focus on budgeting for cybersecurity well in advance, years in advance, even in some cases. And the reason why is the trends that we've observed year over year, month over month. And realistically, the cyber landscape is only growing. It's been that way. It's patternistic at this point. And it's becoming even easier for these low-level, unsophisticated threat actors to majorly impact your business. I mean, it could be teenagers that are running some type of open source software that happen upon a vulnerability in your, tech stack or your infrastructure and happen to exploit it. And realistically speaking, SMBs are top targets at this point for those type of threat actors and other more sophisticated threat actors, specifically because those weaknesses, those vulnerabilities are typically available in some way, shape, or form compared to larger businesses and enterprises that have those dedicated teams that are actually in charge of patching and mitigating vulnerabilities. So this is very applicable for SMBs. Major threats such as ransomware and business email compromise, they're on the rise. They're on the rise against SMBs as well. This trend will certainly continue over time. It has for 3+ years at this time. And many SMBs also don't have the ability to effectively monitor these various data sources across their technology stack. The network traffic, cloud security logs, things like that, that may present precursors, indicators of compromise prior to the attack unfolding. And then realistically, statistics, are present to show that over 60% of SMBs will go out of business within 6 months of a cybersecurity attack. Again, that number may be higher. It also depends certainly on the severity of the cyber incident. The more severe, the more taxing, obviously, the higher percentage that the SMB will suffer more in terms of reputational and brand damage, downtime due to the incident, and the direct cost of remediation and incident response efforts. So realistically, the key trends we've observed, there's a growing pressure on businesses of every industry and every size to meet compliance and regulatory requirements. Organizations typically have to allocate some level of funding to support the efforts to become compliant, the cost of the assessment, the cost of the continual efforts to maintain certification or compliance, depending, of course. And then these requirements, if they're not completed and audited against, they could result in hefty fines depending on the industry you're in, depending on the regulations at hand. And in the event that a certification is revoked due to failing assessment or something such as that, that could cause some level of brand or reputational damage. Clients could feel as though they can't trust your business anymore as they couldn't uphold the certification. So it's very important to apply adequate funding to those ventures. Now, and you've probably heard this, but cyber insurance is now considered to be a necessity, and it is quite expensive, or it can be quite expensive. And ideally, this must be budgeted for. It's a must item, not a should at this point. And there are some things that your organization can do to lower its premium. You can create some top level incident response plans that go through ultimately the communication channels, incident response team members that need to be involved, escalation plans, and other in the event of a cybersecurity incident, and some level of business continuity and disaster recovery planning. Very similar, and they're just kind of a gray area between, but those two things are typically found on any insurance questionnaire or application and ultimately can result in some lower premiums. So that might be an area of opportunity to strike to get one of those lower premiums. And then over the course of time, the last several years, cybersecurity budgets on average have increased. Whether it's 5% year over year, 10% year over year, the point is that cyber budgeting needs to increase year over year for your business as well. It's a necessity. It's not a want, cybersecurity that is, and that pattern of budget increase is likely to continue in the future. On another note, there is a global skills shortage in the cybersecurity industry. I've seen it, I live it, I've read it quite frequently. I was discussing this with my internal team as of very recent in kind of an all hands meeting format. So many organizations, because of this, are turning to managed security service providers, MSSPs. Because these managed service providers have these cybersecurity professionals that have the expertise, that have certifications, that have a vast array of services to support the businesses, where internally that may not be the case. MSSPs offer these escalation points in terms of security that ultimately may not exist internally. Once this incident, once this security event gets to your highest level individual contributor, they can't escalate it beyond themselves, right? They don't have an additional person to escalate to. Whereas an MSSP has many resources to exhaust, cross-functional teams, etc. All right, so we can now jump into, the next slide and get a little bit more into the cost of actually doing business now and why cybersecurity blends directly into that. So as I was saying, cybersecurity is now considered a cost of doing business in 2025, almost already in 2026. It doesn't matter what sector your business operates in. It doesn't matter if you have a physical premise, completely remote, hybrid environment, etc. All businesses at this point use and rely on technology and must secure those technologies in order to proceed, in order to protect its critical processes. So that being said, upfront and thoughtful budgeting allows for a proactive, prioritized, and strategic investment rather than reactive and hectic spending, This is going to be your best way to position your organization to avoid brand damage, therefore the loss of potential clients, both existing and new, brand damage in terms of prestige in the industry. If your organization is renowned in the industry, something like that could really hurt the organization, and degraded customer trust. All of those things happen. All of those things will happen in the event of an incident that does go public. And then obviously the actual damage up front in the event of an incident. So the cybersecurity incident response fees, the downtime caused due to the incident, therefore your organization is not generating revenue at that point, or may not. And then needing to actually invest in fixing the gap that allowed the incident to take place in the first place. So that root cause analysis yield, right? The thing that actually allowed the attacker to gain initial access or whatever the vector was. So budgeting and investing in cybersecurity ultimately will assist in defending against some level of board level liability as well. There's been many horror stories over the years of breaches resulting in the firings of top level members at organizations due to either negligence or lack of documentation listing risks or lack of executives taking matters that CISOs and other security leaders have put in front of them. And ultimately, We're going to look and talk about some of the typical business differentiators in terms of cyber budgeting on the next slide. And I think that'll be pivotal in kind of allowing you and your organization to understand what it is that you should be looking at. So, like I was mentioning, there are a bunch of different budgeting differentiators. And ultimately, these are not all of them by any means. However, I wanted to highlight a few, the first of which is business size and growth. So business size and growth, it's pretty obvious. It'll have a direct impact on your budget, therefore your cybersecurity budget, therefore what you're able to accomplish in terms of cybersecurity controls and other, right? So larger companies tend to have more employees, tend to have more clients, tend to have more data, tend to have more applications to secure. All of those things tend to be true, meaning that they typically require a higher investment into protecting those assets. Now, that being the case, larger security or companies also tend to allocate more resources for security. However, SMBs should not assume they are safe because they are frequently targeted. Just because you're not a large organization with a large digital footprint does not mean that you cannot be attacked, right? So that's just putting it out there. There is some type of false hope that, smaller organizations think that they're safe strictly because they're not big names, that they're not highly touted, but that's just not true. And ultimately, as your organization grows, its cybersecurity investments must grow too. If you're rapidly expanding, you're going to be taking in more data, taking in new systems. If you're, expanding into new industries or acquiring new companies, and if you're looking to expand internationally, all of that applies and then more, right? So your current infrastructure is very important to your cybersecurity budgeting because it's what you do have and ultimately what you do need to protect. And then everything else is potentially future proofing. So the existing infrastructure plays a large role in security spending because, if the organization has outdated systems, if the organization has vulnerabilities on those outdated systems, if the organization has on-premise systems that need to be transitioned up into the cloud, these are very large expenses that are security adjacent that ultimately do secure your environment more, right? If there's some type of legacy application that is very business critical to your organization, that needs to be elevated to the cloud because it's end of life or end of support for that vendor. And all of these things are very expensive and really need to be thought of and budgeted out, well into the future. Moving forward, your industry really plays a large role in the market conditions as to your cybersecurity budget and ultimately where you fall versus another organization. So each industry, they typically have some unique risks that are common between other players in that industry and are key in determining the security needs. Different sectors have different threats. Some have strict compliance requirements. Some have none at all. And additionally, technology and cybersecurity are continuously evolving, each and every day. That's just, the case. New advances, whether you are following AI or whether you're following uh, any type of additional computing that is coming out, quantum computing that is, there are new advances and thus new defenses that need to be had depending on the likelihood and severity to actually, impact your business. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. So it may be wise, that being said, that there are these evolving threats to leave some of the budget protected for those new emergent threats that your organization ultimately may need to be protected against. Not everything can be thought of, so maybe putting some aside could play a relatively massive role in the future. Yep. Moving forward, we can actually talk about the first step in realizing what you need to budget for, how you go about establishing your foundation for your budget. So that being said, you need to identify your risks, not at a granular level per se, but some level of high level risk mapping would be good. So it's important to understand at a high level what the major risks are to your organization. So thinking through that, these are some good starter points. What data do you store and process? Are you an organization that stores sensitive data? Personally identifiable information, PHI, PCI, all these protected data, sensitive data types, right? Where you need to be a little bit more stringent upon protecting the data, ensuring the data does not get exfiltrated or accessed without authorization. This could actually lead to the organization needing to contact the impacted individuals in the event of exfiltration, and leading to public statements, all of which add to exposure, all of which, theoretically damage the organization. So very important to think about that. Additionally, what are your most critical assets? Is it network equipment? Are they VIP accounts, your executive leadership's cloud accounts or Active Directory accounts or something like that? Or is it data storage locations if you have separate data storage, right? So all of those things need to be taken into consideration. Critical equals obviously a higher risk if, compromised or breached in any capacity. And then who is it that is actually likely to target your organization? Is it, like I mentioned earlier, those unsophisticated actors? Is it a nation state actor or whatever have you, right? There are definitely going to be some unsophisticated actors that are just looking to probe the network, running some open source technologies, and are unlikely to be successful should the organization have competent controls in place. But in the event a nation state actor is at play, these are highly funded, highly motivated, highly sophisticated actors. They often require organizations to have the utmost security controls in place in order to not be able to get into your environment. They're very sophisticated, very good at what they do, right? So it's important to understand who is targeting you, and that should, allow you to allocate funding one way or another. And then at the end of the day, what are your most essential processes and the underlying systems that keep them functional, right? So in a business continuity disaster recovery sense, if you've identified that, let's say your accounting system, your HRIS, your email, those are all of your, operational systems that are, most critical to the business. Ultimately, how can you plan to keep those up in the event of a cybersecurity incident, in the event of an ordinary disaster, etc.? So putting some controls around those is likely a good idea. How do you bolster that? How do you defend against it being impacted? All that's very important. And these 4 points really give you a strong foundation for establishing, that high level risk mapping methodology. And then leading into that, you have that information, but you haven't gone a step granular from there. You haven't performed a gap assessment. You haven't figured out how to identify the individual controls you're missing, or just, the secondary level, the tertiary level controls that you're missing. So performing a gap assessment is going to be necessary in some cases. It's not completely necessary, but it's definitely recommended. So you have those high level risk vectors. You want to now conduct your gap assessment to understand how well you are or are not protected against those risks and maybe other ones that are findings from the assessment. So utilizing an industry standard framework like a NIST CSF, a CIS controls, ISO 27001, excuse me, or a combination of both, that'll be your frameworks that you blend together for the gap assessment, or you use one or the other. There are very many good controls in all those frameworks. And this will ultimately provide you a baseline of where the organization currently is, what they do well, what they do poorly, and what they may not have implemented at all. Therefore, a formal gap, right? So these frameworks and assessing yourself or having someone assess you against these frameworks will identify gaps in, your asset inventory, your identity and access management, and things alike. So for instance, should the output show that you have stellar technical controls in place for email security and identity and access management, but you do not have written policies explaining the practices and processes associated, that may be a gap. But in that same aspect, from the endpoint detection and response perspective, you may only have a legacy antivirus that isn't capable of doing anti-malware and things associated, anti-ransomware, protect against fileless attacks. So you may need something in terms of that technical EDR solution or some additional endpoint protection rather than just a legacy advanced antivirus system. So moving beyond that, I want to show a couple of examples as to what the output can look like, what the output may look like, but ultimately, feel free to customize what's important to you at the end of the day. So this is a basic example of how you could formulate the output to determine what is worthwhile budgeting for and tackling based on a couple of factors that we see: cost, resourcing required, impact to the business in terms of risk level, right? So impact equals risk level in this perspective. And if we look at the first row, right, the organization in this case has been examined to have no ability to effectively monitor the logs stemming from its cloud utilities. That is a major gap, as we all know, very much takes place in the cloud these days. So a likelihood and impact score has been derived to output a severity score in this case, which guides how impactful it is to the organization, while the cost and effort field assists the organization in understanding the burden that they would have to take on to solve this gap or mitigate in some cases, right? So stemming beyond that, in the rows below, we can see that all these factors, notably cost and effort, will guide the organization in determining how to prioritize these gaps and the remediation effort to come in terms of what can be budgeted for in terms of money and time. right? So it stems down. We've got, some moderate impact, we've got some major impact, and then we've got variable cost. So we have some cost that is low, we have some effort that is minimal. So it may be worthwhile to take advantage of the fact that those resourcing requirements are lower in some cases. And then a methodology to potentially live by to start, if nothing else: high impact and low cost. This is going to essentially position the organization to make the biggest impact at the lowest cost, as is suggested, right? So with the assessment having been completed, you have that output information. You're able to understand the existing gaps. You're able to formulate the treatment actions or remediation actions to, secure those gaps or cure those gaps and prioritize the remediation efforts. So not every control has an equal impact, kind of as we saw in that little blurb. So by default, organizations should attempt to prioritize solving gaps on high impact, low cost, or low level of effort items, right? So a couple of examples could be for that high impact and low cost could be MFA, multi-factor authentication. It's a great mechanism, as we all know. MFA is very popular at this point, needs to be in place. It's a great mechanism to employ to better authentication practices, ensuring accounts are protected even if they have weak passwords, right? And this may be a low cost item and a low level of effort item if you have some type of existing licensing that you can use and bring MFA into the fold, like through Microsoft Authenticator or something, to that effect. The same is true with email protection. Phishing is far too common these days. It's only going to increase, and organizations face these hundreds of times a day, depending on the organization, thousands of times a day. Phishing emails hit the email gateway if one has one, or come directly through, right? So the organization should try to budget for basic email filtering and phishing protection, anti-phishing. And again, this may also be included in licensing if you're within the Microsoft stack or something adjacent that has 365 Defender capabilities. And a basic EDR, like I was talking about, legacy antivirus solutions are not enough. They're not good. They don't defend against the attacks of today, right? So if the organization has end user facing machines that connect to the internet, it's essential to install a better endpoint detection and response EDR agent to detect and prevent these attacks, right? And this will have a great impact on the organization's defenses and secure the assets of the organization. Right. So all those are high impact and low cost, but realistically, great, we've got that, but what else do we need to take into consideration in terms of prioritization, right? So we've got risk to continuity. So as I believe I talked about a little bit ago, in the business continuity and disaster recovery, front, it's important to the organization that business operations persist and are not interrupted, right? So you have to be sure to take into consideration when evaluating what to prioritize. You want to make sure that whatever you're doing adds to continuity, right? Doesn't subtract from it, obviously, adds to protecting continuity and upholding continuity. And then insurance requirements, right? It's possible that your cyber insurance qualification and continual qualification depends on certain things that you need to budget for, like continual vulnerability assessments. Maybe you have to conduct a vulnerability assessment at least once a year, and maybe you have to create an incident response plan, as I talked about earlier, and maybe you have to run tabletop exercises to test your incident response plan, make sure everyone's on the same page, make sure the process flow is correct, etc. So moving on from that, we have the high impact and low cost, and now we're really comfortable in terms of a budget foundation. So as we move on to the next screen, we'll see a little bit more about that. How do we build upon that budget foundation? So in terms of budget foundation, there are a couple of, well, more than a couple of key considerations that we need to, take into perspective. And these are typically, and there are more, right? And there can be depending on the business, but these are typically people, technology, process and governance, and ongoing services. And there can definitely be other, categories, but these are the ones that we definitely wanted to highlight because they're typical of businesses. And people, it's important when dealing with the people perspective of the budget foundation to consider whether to keep internal security staffing if it exists, if those individuals are in place, or to shift to a managed service provider such as we were talking about earlier, right? Or you could have a combination of both. You could have a top level security individual internal to the company that kind of guides and oversees the managed security service provider individuals that work a SOC or something similar. So with people, obviously salary and benefits will primarily guide the effort of, determining whether to go one direction or another. But it's essential to think about other things, right? Training, budgeting for training, budgeting for certifications for staff to be more aware and more capable at securing the business. That you don't necessarily need to worry about when dealing with an MSP because the MSP should realistically guide its individuals to be subject matter experts, hold high-level certifications, have that knowledge and expertise, years of experience, right? Jumping into technology, there are certain things that certainly need to be a part of the foundation. So I was alluding to this previously. Endpoint protection, whether it's EDR, whether you extend beyond that and you go XDR, it's important to secure the organization's physical assets. Email security and phishing protection, I need not talk anymore about that right now because we all know that that is just a trend that is going to persist over time. Now, cloud security tools, depending on your industry, it may be important for you to budget for that. If you have any type of highly protected data type or sensitive data type, a data loss prevention mechanism may be a necessity for you. Just to say, hey, this email that you're sending external has been detected to have a social security number present. Let's restrict it, or let's make sure that it goes out via encryption, or some other means, right? And then secure remote access and other, you want to make sure that the environment is not easily achieved in terms of access to it by attackers, and those attackers or individuals that are legitimate must be properly authorized, right? So moving on beyond the people and technology, we then have to talk about process and governance and other things. So process and governance, as we kind of led the conversation of budgeting, we talked about that high level risk mapping. Well, year over year, and realistically a little bit, of a shorter cadence, maybe quarterly, you should conduct some type of risk assessment. Whether it's an internal individual conducting a risk assessment, whether it's a third party conducting a risk assessment, that potentially needs to be budgeted for as well. Well, whether it's labor hours and such, or whether it's, cost to a third party or cost of a third party, I should say. And then compliance audits. If your organization has to undergo any type of compliance audit, they are not cheap by any means. This is something that needs to be taken into consideration and planned for. Assessors typically charge quite a good amount of money, and that is likely to continue as well. And if necessary, be sure to account for ongoing technology services, recurring cost, right? That must be budgeted for annually, such as if you go the route of an MSSP or SOC, such as penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, security awareness training, and many other things more than likely. And then incident response, right? So this is just begging the question, does it make sense, knock on wood, nothing happens, but does it make sense to budget for incident response costs or some of the incident response costs necessary up front rather than be unprepared and have to scramble for money in the event of an unfortunate incident, right? Is it better to have that little bit of money sitting aside to potentially allow the organization to move faster in the event of an incident? Whereas the organization would likely have to escalate in the event of an incident, get approval from a CFO or another party to then be able to get an incident response firm on board, etc. But again, you have your cyber insurance in that case potentially, so maybe it's easiest to just go that route. But something to consider, not a necessity per se. And then moving on forward, gauging the cyber investments, when building your budget. So using the information that you gained from the risk assessment and the gap assessment, you're now able to create that maturity-based budgeting that will allow the organization to form that solid security foundation and move beyond that, right? So increase your security posture if you've already formulated that foundation. So there are a multitude of ways to gauge how much should be invested in security, and obviously the answer from me would be as much as you reasonably can out of your IT budget, or other if it's separate. But realistically speaking, what we typically see is an average of between 15 and 20% of the overall IT budget is allocated directly to cybersecurity, which again, depending on the budget, can be very generous or can be very little. So it can differ from organization to organization and overall size of the IT budget, but that's typically what we do see. So moving beyond that, we'll talk a little bit more about the typical cybersecurity budget and ultimately the factors that go into that and what we typically see in terms of percentage devoted to that area, right? So your budget's going to be completely unique to your company. However, on average, we see that software eats up a good percentage of the cybersecurity budget at about 30% or so, right? Your endpoint protection agent, your email security, your backup services, all those things are not cheap. And then additional services stemming off from that. So consulting, such as a security advisor, or managed security services, such as a dedicated SOC or network security engineers to maintain the firewall switches, or a fractional CISO or other top level security advisor. And then finally, personnel. Actually, excuse me. Well, there's hardware to be fair, but that is a lesser expense, more than likely, with the transition to cloud resourcing, virtualization another. But then personnel also eats up a large percentage, right? So you've got your salary, your benefits, your training, right? So internal staffing can be a large expense in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity personnel are not a dime a dozen, and when they're good, they're typically expensive. And that could be an advantage of moving to an MSSP or not, depending, right? So past that, we're going to talk about now how budgeting, really works in the industries, and ultimately, what I would suggest each industry really hone in on in terms of, tips for budgeting in that industry. So starting with that, we talk a lot, about healthcare. We see a lot about healthcare in the news, and ultimately healthcare gets hit a lot with ransomware and other really sophisticated and unfortunate attacks. But realistically, in healthcare, we typically see HIPAA, right, and high tech, and we typically see PHI in the environments, right? So that being the case, endpoint encryption is oftentimes very important. We want to make sure that all data is encrypted and completely inaccessible to unauthorized parties. And DLP, I think I talked about a little bit earlier, data loss prevention. In that industry, the patient and their records are the utmost importance. Nothing is more important. So we need to make sure that we can budget for some type of mechanism to assist in preventing and detecting and preventing exfiltration of that type of information, those data types. And then what's interesting is, in every industry, there are some type of, technology equipment that isn't quite an end user facing machine formally, right? So medical equipment, right? That can potentially, not always, not all times, but potentially be more vulnerable than the majority of other systems due to outdated software and firmware. So it may be important to virtually segment that from the rest of the, the end user facing population in terms of machines. And moving beyond that, we have, the financial industry and ultimately advanced threat protection. So maybe a SIM or an EDR solution, an MDR solution, something to that effect, would be good because in the financial industry, it's quite an attractive target for attackers because it's based in finance. So there's typically some level of mass quantities of money, whether it's either had by that company, or whether that company manages it and has access to it, and the attackers could pivot and get it. It's good to know and be able to detect in the event that something such as that does take place or is leading up to it taking place, right? And also transaction monitoring. Transactions are frequent, and organizations must have a method in place to both verify and monitor, transactions that are going out. Want to be able to validate those transactions before anything bad happens and one slips through the crack. And then moving beyond just the financial and healthcare industry, the legal and professional services industry, right? So there's typically some high value information in that industry as well. And a lot of that industry uses secure file sharing methods and systems, which is great and should be budgeted for when dealing with clientele, when dealing with other third party providers and needing to pass information between, but keep it very much secure. So that's something that should be taken into consideration. Additionally, data classification may be essential to some law firms, as much case-related information is likely to be completely confidential and should only be accessible by a very limited population. So that classifies the information as confidential or whatever the organization deems confidential, and then puts in place that access control to ensure that only the individuals that have access to that type of data will have access to that case-related information, right? And then construction and manufacturing, realistically, going back to what I said about the medical equipment also applies here as well, because you've got those OT systems, the operational technology, that oftentimes have their own set of vulnerabilities, have their own legacy systems and software and firmware that they rely upon, therefore are inherently less secure. So we want to make sure that we can virtually segment them on a VLAN that is, on their own or with other less secure systems, so that in the event of an attack, it doesn't further propagate throughout your network. And then some level of monitoring for those systems, right? So operational technology is typically less secure. Therefore, you should have some level of insights into what is going on and if they're being attacked in any sense or being probed even. So by industry, that's typically, some things that may help and may assist in terms of budgeting, though those few items. Hey, we have this type of data. Okay, we need DLP. Hey, we have this type of system. Okay, we need a budget for, a system that's going to allow us to segment these systems into VLANs. But moving beyond that, there are some additional practical tips for budgeting, and allow you to build that comprehensive budget while also potentially cutting some costs here and there. And some of this is regurgitated from what we've talked about to this point. But what we haven't talked about is the potential for using safe, and I preface safe, open source solutions and free resources for monitoring. So they do exist. However, the caveat to that is I would only suggest that in the event that there is an internal individual, an internal team that has enough knowledge to maintain and action the information presented by those resources, right? Don't want those systems to just exist and no one updates them, no one actions the alerting, etc., right? And then where that's not possible, it might make sense to bundle services with an MSSP so you can get your endpoint protection, you can get the visibility into the cloud resources via an MDR, a SIM solution, something to that effect, and have security awareness training pushed out and other, right? And it's also, of course, as we talked about, important to not overspend on a single control. So unless the control is the solution to a gap that has already been exploited in a previous incident, it's better to divide that spending across multiple areas. It'll make a bigger impact. It'll look better. It'll show that you're not, spending all of your budget on a singular item. A board or a top level executive may look a little bit further into that if you're really spending on one specific item. And then if possible, work monies in to include some type of incident response retainer, even in the event that you do have cyber insurance, which I really hope you do. They may be able to supplement in some capacity, but a good idea nonetheless. And then practice continually, right? So reassess risk, do it on a quarterly cadence, on a biannual cadence if necessary. Or if there's a major change that occurs, if the organization acquires a new company, if the organization, knock on wood, was subject to a breach, these are major changes in which the organization should immediately reevaluate and run an additional risk assessment. And then bleeding over into, past the tips for budgeting, a lot of individuals struggle with or often look for new ways to justify your spend, which can be thought to be difficult as far as cybersecurity is concerned because there isn't traditional, ROI in some perspective, right? So, many individuals balancing cyber budgets often worry about how to properly justify their spending. This is because security doesn't drive revenue and does not, present attractive financial figures. However, it's important to focus on demonstrating the potential return on investment through reduction in successful attacks, improved detection and response time. So, moving from one technology to another to catch things faster to therefore not have them take place, and then the cost of preventing actual incidents from taking place, the cost savings from an incident not actually taking place, right? So framing your budget as supporting revenue protection and business growth enables the business to potentially enter some new markets, answer audit questionnaires. You may get those due diligence questionnaires that are 500 questions long. Answer those quicker, and then ultimately protect the organization. So gaining a new security certification such as a SOC 2 Type 2 and ISO 27001, very well recognized certifications, that may open up new opportunities for revenue generation because the organization may, at that point be able to go out into different markets, up market or adjacent into different markets, and open up some new opportunities to drive revenue through additional clientele. Right. And then when dealing with these top level executives, a lot of the time we have to use some type of risk quantification. We have to translate the risk that's presented on one of those previous screens, as you saw, into financials that resonate with the executives. That's ultimately what they want to see. That's what they care about. So showing the potential impact of security incidents and the value of preventative measures. Show how expensive brand damage can be. Show how expensive the loss of prospective clients can be, the loss of existing clients, the actual cost of incident response efforts, and then obviously the cost of downtime to your organization. These are all very impactful points that could, make or break your justification statement. So, if you don't budget for cybersecurity or you don't properly budget for cybersecurity or nearly enough, what can happen, right? So when companies delay investing in cybersecurity, that's typically when cyber criminals act, as they're going to take the low-hanging fruit. If your organization has lesser controls than the next organization that they were looking at, they're going to focus their much lesser efforts needed on your organization. That's just reality at the end of the day. And as you can see, the spend by enterprises due to breach is quite large and has increased. This number is up from last year. And it's very unlikely that an SMB will ever see that figure. However, it's very possible that incident response costs can equate to something such as $250,000 for a basic incident for an SMB. And there are other potential costs due to regulations and other that you may have to spend in terms of fines. But realistically, I love advising and meeting with the clients who have the forethought to budget for cybersecurity and potentially advising in advance of the attack, rather than the unfortunate incident of, a client who first comes to me after experiencing that incident. And then we have to work together to first rebuild the foundation of the business, remediate the business processes and operations, and then we can actually think about budgeting. But that budget has been slashed due to the costs that were actually put out due to the incident, right? So effectively, if an incident does take place, that can also slash your budget, because you maybe had to use some of the money from the year forward or whatever have you, or other areas to help rebuild that business, help remediate the situation. And then moving past that, you build the foundation, you continually improve over time, and then you can get to a point where you really have an even stronger foundation, and then you're looking for opportunities to optimize the budget. So once you have all of that, there are a couple of things that you can do, which is potentially powerful in terms of cost savings, right? So vendor consolidation and legacy tech divestment. In terms of all of that, you really want to strategize how to consolidate your vendors and software to receive some type of cost savings. So if you have X company or X vendor for one service and then the same thing for another service, but it's all under the umbrella of either, it may make sense to go with consolidating your services under the one vendor versus having several vendors, just because you may have some type of cost savings. They may bundle pricing or something to that effect. Additionally, what a lot of people don't think of is having to actually maintain all of those systems and action all of those systems segmented, not centralized. That could cause a reduction in administrative overhead if you consolidate. So consolidating those systems, you can get back some internal labor potentially. And then leveraging an MSP, as I talked about, is definitely an option, right? You can potentially get very experienced cybersecurity professionals at a fraction of the cost of maintaining internal staffing. That's just the truth. And then, now that the savings are present due to the optimization, you can always attempt to solve another gap now that you have the money back, and go right back to the high impact, low cost options that you had that maybe you couldn't get all of them done. So reinvesting those savings really does allow you to optimize your budget and optimize your security at the same time. And then, moving up next is a really nice graphic to show the budgeting process, step one all the way through step five or A to Z, whatever have you. So the budgeting process can realistically be thought of as, risk mapping, as we talked about first, assessing for gaps, prioritizing the gaps for remediation based on the various factors, impact, cost, etc., resourcing, and then applying the budget justification, and then continually optimizing your budget. All of those things really is a holistic approach, year in, year out, right? Not just one year, or, here and there every other year. Every single year that you have to balance a budget, you should, conduct this exact process, and maybe multiple times a year in the event of that type of, major change or major impact to your org. And moving past that, there are some things that ultimately I've talked about on the call that, DataPrize can assist with should you want to move forward with DataPrize. DataPrize is able to and has for a long time now provided security gap assessments based on those industry leading frameworks and more that I discussed. And then for a more formal guidance and advising on budgeting and very many areas of cybersecurity, the virtual or fractional CISO may be of interest, right? That service, can result in security road mapping, planning those remediations or solving those gaps, right? And then assisting with the assigned priority and values of those controls and initiatives. Assist with board level presentations regarding the cyber budget or potentially different things. And then building that valid business justification case. If you need assistance building that, justification, if you're having issues with, coming up with ideas to present that, makes sense to the executives. And then obviously DataPrize is an MSSP. DataPrize has managed security services using best in class leading security technologies to support endpoint protection, email security, overall monitoring, whatever it is that you need, and obviously very much adjacent to this presentation and very much aligned with it. DataPrize is able to assist. So more than likely, should you conduct that gap assessment by yourself, another third party, DataPrize can also assist with the outcome, the yields.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. That was so much good information. Thank you for sharing it with all of us. And also, I will just say, if you all are as enthralled with Josh and all of his knowledge as I am, you can work with him. He is a VCISO for Data Prize. He has a great team, him and his team, all full of really amazing knowledge and expertise, can lead you through processes just like what we've gone through today. So, thanks again, Josh, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you to our audience on the line for joining us today. We are going to move into our Q&A time. First, really quickly, if you want to do some further reading on this subject, we have a QR code for you. We have a cybersecurity budgeting workbook. We will be sending this link in the follow-up materials. So, if you are a skeptical security person who doesn't like to scan random QR codes, you will get it. I've also listed the link at the bottom. That page is actually full of IT budgeting resources. You'll get right to the workbook, but if you scroll up or down, there's a ton of other budgeting and security budgeting stuff for you to find there. So we really encourage you to check that out. And so we'll take these few minutes here that we have left for some Q&A. First question to you, Josh. How could small security teams approach executive team about increasing the budget if currently following a compliance framework like SOC 2 or ISO?
Okay, sure. That question potentially a bit general, so I apologize if I go in a different direction than was intended. But a couple of questions I would ask myself: are these frameworks mandated, mainly, by an executive leadership or top level leadership beyond yourself, or is this something that IT is actively pursuing, right? In information technology department. Is the organization's goal to actually achieve the certification or just kind of adherence to that standard or that framework, right? So a couple of things that I would ask myself. And then depending on the industry, it might be pretty valuable, as I think I said earlier, having one of those certifications, both getting it for the first time and then maintaining it could drive some new business generation, should an organization obtain one of those. And that could allow the organization to go up market, expand its current client portfolio into new industries, and drive further revenue, which is really the most attractive thing to executive leadership, more than likely, right? So all of those things would be fantastic. And then it should also be noted that all of the avenues that require expense, internal labor, third party preparation, if you're using a preparation company to assist you with whatever certification or framework you're pursuing, right? And then the actual third party assessor, who's going to be your assessor to either pass fail you and give you your areas of concerns, your AOCs. And then the actual implementations necessary to cure those areas of concerns, AOCs. Those are all things that need to be taken into consideration in terms of how you need to increase the budget if you are going to pursue something like that, and potential areas to justify it, right? So saying it could drive further revenue, and saying, hey, because of that, I need an additional personnel or person on staff to assist me with that, or I need monies aside for a third party preparation company because I don't have time or I don't have expertise to pursue that. So those are a couple of things that I would definitely take into consideration with that question.
Awesome. The next question, what do I have to do when I have a tight budget, and what's the step up from the minimum?
Yeah, so as I referred to probably plenty in the presentation, if you have a tight budget, or if you have any budget at all, it's definitely important to focus on those high impact, low cost outputs from that gap assessment or similar assessment, right? That's going to inform you of what you can do to best secure your business for that most minimal cost, because it's not going to be minimal cost, but in comparison to the other items, right? And there's no exact minimum in terms of security, I wouldn't say professionally, but I would always work toward building at least a secure baseline that covers the basics at a reasonable level, and define that as the minimum. For instance, making sure the organization has some level of endpoint security, some level of network security, some level of email security, right? All of those things. I would make sure it's holistic, but it can be relatively shallow in terms of actual security layers and technologies there. But that's probably what I would say in terms of a minimum and a tight budget.
Awesome. And the next one here, how to best balance the question, how much is enough from an ethical perspective, how to make the argument that you are providing rational man levels of security, but not over investing.
Right. So again, as a cybersecurity professional, I wouldn't believe in necessarily overinvesting in cybersecurity just because of where we are today and the necessity. But, if the executive should have fear of overspending, which can be common certainly on cybersecurity, or don't have a level of trust in those balancing that security budget per se, it can be best to take real world examples of companies in your industry, maybe even adjacent to your industry, that have been hit by a cyber attack, and the amount of time, money, resources that it costs them to recover, right? So showing that executive, hey, it happened to them, it can happen to us, maybe reverses that fear factor and puts the fear into them to then, kind of say, hey, executives, this shows you how expensive a breach can be, and it really could happen to us. So we do need additional budgeting, or this is justifying my spending on cybersecurity. Additionally, kind of like I talked about earlier, to move away from that fear factor in terms of executives fearing overspending on cybersecurity, don't dump all of the money, if you can help it, into a singular area, right? Rather attempt to cover multiple areas of concern. So if you have areas of concern such as email security, endpoint protection, backup and disaster recovery, et cetera, incident response planning, try to sprinkle it across as best as possible per the output from your gap assessment, rather than dumping all of it into one of those areas, right? Because then you still leave those three other areas of concerns untouched at that point.
Mhm. All right, next question here that has come in. When it comes to reevaluating current security and IT tools implemented, is it recommended to replace them occasionally?
Yeah, so I'm definitely a firm believer in, despite a, best in class by brand name utility, if you do have the time and can spare the time, doing some type of relatively formal assessment would be good. So taking apart what are the actual features you're looking for in that system, in terms of security. So if it's an endpoint detection system, are you just worried about, file-based attacks? Do you need to worry about file-less attacks? Do you need a system that's behavioral, works on behavioral level, or do you need something that works on signatures, right? So realistically, taking it apart, whatever technology you're looking for, writing down the important features to you and assessing the vendors based on those features, price point, and other things is probably the approach I would take. But yes, I would say that continuously assessing vendors is a good idea, just because you never know ultimately what can come in at a lesser price point and be just as effective, if not more effective.
Awesome. Thank you. And then one last question here, which I can actually answer. Can we get a copy of this PowerPoint deck? Yes, you will get a copy. We will email you to the email that you registered with, or for the person that asked this, I will make sure the email you put in this question is on the list to get a copy of this. We will be sending out the slides as well as the recording of this session so you can review at your leisure. All right, so that's all the questions we have for today. So I'm just going to close this out here with a thank you to our audience for joining us. An extra thank you to Josh for sharing all of your knowledge with us. We do have a short survey that will appear after the event ends. Please take a moment to fill it out, give us some feedback. It helps us create even better webinars for the next time. And speaking of next time, we hope to see you on the next one. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bye, all.